My husband dragged me to the gala to show me off to the new owner. "Stay at the back. Your dress is embarrassing," he hissed. When the billionaire finally arrived, he completely ignored my husband's outstretched hand. He walked straight toward me, gently took my hands, his eyes filling with tears, and whispered, "I've been searching for you for 30 years. I still love you." My husband's glass slipped from his fingers. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and write in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my voice has traveled." I should have realized Fletcher was up to something the moment he suddenly insisted I go with him to the corporate gala. In 25 years of marriage, he had never once wanted me beside him at a work event. I was always the stay-at-home wife, the quiet one who kept the house running, pressed his shirts, and made sure dinner was ready whenever he returned from his important meetings with important people. "You're coming with me tonight," he declared that Tuesday morning, barely glancing up from his Wall Street Journal. "The new CEO will be there. Morrison Industries just got bought out, and I need to make the right impression." I froze mid-pour as I refilled his coffee, the pot trembling in my hand. "Are you sure you want me there? I don't really have anything suitable for something that fancy." Fletcher's gray eyes flicked up with that familiar expression of contempt. "Then find something. Buy something cheap if you have to. Just don't embarrass me." Don't embarrass me. Those 3 words had been the background noise of our marriage for more than 2 decades. Don't embarrass me by talking too much at dinner parties. Don't embarrass me by bringing up your family. Don't embarrass me by taking up too much space in rooms where you were never really welcome. I spent the rest of the week combing through thrift stores and bargain racks with the $200 Fletcher gave me each month for my personal expenses. Everything of mine came out of that allowance: clothes, toiletries, even small hostess gifts for his colleagues' wives during holidays. After 25 years, I had become a professional at making a few dollars stretch into something presentable. The dress I finally found was a long-sleeved navy blue one. Simple, modest, but with a quiet elegance. It cost $45 at a consignment shop, and the woman at the counter assured me it originally came from a high-end department store. I pressed it carefully and hung it at the back of my closet, trying not to dwell on the certainty that Fletcher would still find fault with it. The night of the gala arrived sooner than I would have liked. Fletcher stepped out of his dressing room in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in an entire year. His silver hair was slicked back, and he wore his father's gold watch, the one that reminded everyone he came from old money, even if his company was drowning in debt. "You ready?" he asked, then stopped when he saw me. His face darkened instantly. "That's what you're wearing?" I glanced down at my dress, suddenly seeing it through his eyes. What had felt elegant in the store now seemed plain and outdated. "I thought it looked nice," I said quietly. "It was the best I could manage with the budget you gave me." Fletcher shook his head in disgust. "It'll have to do. Just stay in the background tonight. Don't draw attention to yourself. And for God's sake, don't talk about anything personal. These are serious business people." The drive to the Grand Hyatt downtown was silent, except for the classical music Fletcher liked and the occasional sound of him checking his phone. I sat beside him with my hands folded in my lap, fingers unconsciously brushing the small silver locket at my throat. It was the only piece of jewelry I owned that he hadn't bought for me, the only thing in my life that felt truly mine. I had worn it every single day for 30 years, tucked beneath my clothes where no one could see it. The hotel ballroom was exactly what I imagined: crystal chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, and people who measured their own value in stock portfolios and vacation homes. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. Everywhere I looked, women glided past in gowns that surely cost more than our monthly mortgage. "Stay here," Fletcher ordered, pointing to a dim corner near the bar where tall decorative plants cast deep shadows. "I need to find some people. Don't wander off." I nodded and watched him march away, shoulders stiff with manufactured confidence. I knew how precarious things really were. I had overheard the late-night phone calls, the tense discussions about loans, deadlines, and longtime clients taking their business elsewhere. This gala was a last, frantic attempt to pull himself back from the brink of bankruptcy. I stood where he left me, slowly sipping a glass of water and observing the crowd. Executives laughed too loudly at each other's jokes. Their wives compared jewelry and vacation destinations. Everyone seemed utterly certain of their place in that world, while I hovered at the edges like a ghost in my $45 dress. About 20 minutes passed before I spotted Fletcher across the room, talking animatedly to a group of men in expensive suits. His face was flushed, and even from where I stood, I could see the desperation in the way he moved his hands, as if he were trying to grab hold of his own slipping future. Whatever pitch Fletcher was trying to make, it was obvious they weren't buying it. Then the atmosphere in the room changed. Conversations dipped, laughter faded, and faces began to turn toward the main entrance. I craned my neck to see what everyone was looking at and felt the air leave my lungs. A tall man in a flawless tuxedo stepped into the ballroom. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and he moved with the calm, effortless authority of someone who actually possessed power, not someone desperately pretending to have it. Even from across the room, there was something uncannily familiar about his posture, the way he carried himself. My heart stuttered in my chest, reacting faster than my mind could. "That's him," someone near me whispered. "That's Julian Blackwood, the new CEO." Julian. The name struck me like a physical blow. It couldn't be. After 30 years, it couldn't possibly be him. But as he turned slightly, scanning the crowd with those dark eyes I knew better than my own, I realized, without a shadow of doubt, that it was him. Julian Blackwood. The man I had loved with every part of my soul when I was 22, the man whose child I had carried for 3 months before my entire world fell apart, the man I'd been forced to leave behind in that little college town, along with every dream we'd built together. He was older now, his features sharpened and refined by time and success, but his face was still the same, that strong jaw, those intense eyes that always seemed to look straight through to who you really were. The slight tilt of his head when he was thinking, my Julian, who hadn't been mine for 30 years. I shrank further back into the shadows, my heart pounding so hard it made my fingers tremble. What were the odds that he would be the new CEO of the company Fletcher was so desperate to impress? That our lives would collide again in this room, on this night? Across the ballroom, Fletcher spotted Julian and immediately began muscling his way through the crowd toward him. I watched helplessly as my husband approached the only man I had ever truly loved, hand thrust out, his smile wide and hungry. Julian took his hand out of politeness, but it was obvious, even from a distance, that he wasn't really listening to whatever Fletcher was saying. His eyes were restless, combing through the sea of faces, searching for something, or someone. And then, as though pulled by an invisible thread, his gaze landed on me. The world froze. For a heartbeat that stretched into forever, Julian Blackwood looked straight at me from across that glittering ballroom. All the color drained from his face, his lips parting in stunned recognition. The polished businessman facade shattered, and for a single, raw moment he was 25 again. The young man who had once looked at me like love alone could rewrite destiny. Then he started moving. He walked toward me with single-minded focus, as if the 100 other people in that room were nothing but furniture. Fletcher kept talking to empty space for a few seconds before realizing that Julian was no longer beside him. I saw the confusion cross my husband's face, then the panic, as he followed Julian's line of sight and realized who his new CEO was heading toward. "Excuse me," Julian said to Fletcher, still not looking at him. His voice was deeper now, roughened by years and experience, but it had the same effect on me. It made my knees weak. "I need to speak with your wife." Fletcher stammered something about there being a mistake, about me being nobody important, but Julian was already walking away. He came straight to where I stood rooted in place, stopped just close enough that I could smell his cologne, rich, subtle, expensive. Nothing like the cheap aftershave he used to wear in our college apartment. "Marin," he said. Hearing my name in his voice after 30 years broke something open inside me. My eyes flooded with tears I had refused to cry for decades. "Julian," I whispered, my voice barely there. Without hesitation, he reached out and took both of my hands in his, just like he used to when we were young and invincible. His hands were warm, steady. My breath caught when I realized his ring finger was bare, no wedding band, no indent where one might have been. "I've been looking for you for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. His dark eyes shone with unshed tears, and when he spoke again, his words rang out clearly in the suddenly hushed ballroom. "I still love you." The sharp crack of Fletcher's champagne glass, shattering against the marble floor, echoed through the silence like a gunshot. Julian's confession hung in the air between us, a fragile bridge stretching back across 3 lost decades. I didn't know if I was brave enough to step onto it. Around us, the gala had completely stopped. Conversations dropped mid-word. Every important person in that room was now an audience member, watching us. I could feel their stares like heat on my skin, but all I could see was Julian, older, more weathered, but irrevocably the same man I had never stopped loving. "This is insane," Fletcher snarled, slicing through the moment. He shoved himself between us, his face blotchy with humiliation and rage. "Marin, what the hell is going on?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. How could I compress 30 years of grief, guilt, and unfinished love into one sentence in front of a room full of strangers? How could I explain to my husband that he had always been a shelter from a storm I never truly escaped, not the love of my life? Julian didn't look away from me, not even once. "Could we talk in private?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying a quiet command that demanded respect. Fletcher let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Private? She's my wife. Anything you have to say to her, you can say right here." "No," Julian replied, his tone firm and immovable. "I can't." The intensity in his gaze was almost too much to bear. In his eyes I saw everything we had lost, every question that had never been answered, every wound time had failed to close, and underneath it all, a love that had somehow refused to die after 30 long years apart. I could also see the sheer panic in Fletcher's eyes, the way his hands trembled as it dawned on him that the evening he'd planned so carefully was collapsing in front of everyone. "Julian," I finally managed, my voice barely more than a breath. "I can't. Not here. Not like this." He studied my face and nodded slowly, understanding me in a way Fletcher never had. "Of course," he said softly, "but Marin." He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a business card, thick white stock with silver embossing. "Please call me. We need to talk." I took it with shaking fingers, our hands brushing for the briefest second. That tiny touch sent a jolt through me, a visceral reminder of what it felt like to be loved, not owned. "We're leaving," Fletcher barked suddenly, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. He clamped his hand around my arm so hard it made me wince. Julian's expression darkened when he saw Fletcher's grip. For a moment, I thought he might step in, but I gave the smallest shake of my head, and he stopped himself, muscles tight with restraint. "I'll be waiting for your call," he said quietly. Fletcher hauled me out of the ballroom, dragging me past rows of staring faces and half-whispered gossip. I clutched Julian's business card in my free hand, the sharp corners cutting into my skin like a fragile lifeline. The drive home was a blur of shouted accusations and furious questions from Fletcher, but his voice seemed distant, muffled. My mind was already miles and decades away, in a small college town where I'd once been young and fearless and wildly in love. Julian and I had met in our junior year at Colorado State. I was a literature major on a partial scholarship, working 3 different jobs to cover everything financial aid didn't. He was a rising star in the business school, brilliant, ambitious, but with a kindness that didn't fit the stereotype. Boys like him weren't supposed to notice girls like me, but he had. Our first real conversation happened during finals week in the library. I was sprawled across 3 chairs, buried in textbooks, surrounded by empty coffee cups and highlighters when he walked up with that familiar, thoughtful tilt of his head. "You look like you need actual food," he said, amused but gentle. The cafeteria closes in 20 minutes, but I know a place that stays open all night. 24-hour diner, best pie in town. I glanced up from my Victorian-lit book, ready to decline. I didn't have money for diners, or time for whatever game a rich boy might be playing. I can't afford diners, I answered honestly. But thank you. I didn't ask if you could afford it, he replied quietly. I asked if you were hungry. That was Julian, straight to the point, slicing through pride and pretense to whatever was real. We went to the diner that night. He bought me apple pie and listened while I talked about novels, grades, and the scholarship I was terrified of losing. He didn't boast about his family's money or his future empire. He just listened, truly listened, in a way no one ever had before. After that, we were inseparable. Julian opened the doors of his world to me, cocktail parties, country clubs, glossy charity events, but he also slipped away from that polished universe to meet me in mine. Late-night study sessions, greasy pizza in cramped dorm rooms, cheap coffee at 2 a.m. We talked about everything, books and business, childhood scars and impossible dreams, the life we were building together one conversation at a time. The night he proposed was simple and perfect. We were sitting in our favorite spot by the campus lake, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Julian pulled out his grandmother's emerald ring, old-fashioned and stunning, and his hands were shaking as he slid it onto my finger. "Marry me, Marin," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." I said yes without a second thought. We were 22 and convinced that love could bulldoze any obstacle in its path. We planned a small wedding after graduation, a honeymoon in Europe, and a tiny apartment we would share while he finished his MBA. At 22, the future felt wide open, obedient, ours. Julian's parents, however, had a very different vision. Charles and Victoria Blackwood were old-money Denver, people who evaluated relationships the way they evaluated investments, in terms of status and strategic value. When they found out their only son was engaged to a scholarship girl from a middle-class family, their reaction was swift and merciless. They threatened to cut him off entirely. No more tuition, no trust fund, no place in the family business their ancestors had spent generations building. But the worst part wasn't what they'd do to him. They made it clear what they could do to me. They threatened my scholarship, my academic record, the future I had clawed my way toward. Charles Blackwood had influence everywhere, including deep within the university administration. One well-placed phone call from him, and everything I depended on could disappear overnight. "They can't do this," Julian said when he told me about their ultimatum. We were in his apartment, and his face was white with rage. "I'll fight them. I'll walk away from all of it. The money, the business, everything. We'll build our own life." But I already knew something he didn't. I was pregnant. I had found out 3 days earlier, sitting on the cold tile of my dorm bathroom floor, staring at a positive test with shaking hands. I was 22, broke, madly in love, and carrying the child of a man whose family would rather burn our lives to the ground than accept me. That night, I made the most painful decision of my life. I ended things with Julian without ever telling him about the baby. I took off his grandmother's ring, put it back in his trembling hand, and walked away from the future we'd built, leaving my heart and our child's unspoken existence behind with him. I told him I'd realized we were too different, that I didn't want the future he was offering me. I watched his heart shatter right in front of me, saw the confusion, the hurt, the way his world tilted, and I almost broke. But I stayed firm. I let him believe I had stopped loving him instead of telling him the truth, that his parents' threats had terrified me, that I was carrying his child, that I was sacrificing our future to spare him from having to choose between me and everything he'd ever known. 3 weeks later, I lost the baby. A sudden, devastating miscarriage at 8 weeks. I sat in a hospital emergency room, bleeding and alone, grieving not only the child I'd never get to meet, but the life that had already slipped through my fingers. Julian tried to reach out in those weeks, but I couldn't bear to see him. I couldn't face telling him that I had destroyed us for nothing, that the child we were supposed to have together was gone. So when Fletcher Morrison asked me to marry him 6 months later, I said yes. Fletcher was safe, predictable. Everything Julian wasn't. He wasn't the love of my life, but he offered stability and a chance to start over. I told myself I could grow to love him, or, at the very least, learn to be content with the life he was offering. I was wrong about that, the way I had been wrong about so many things. Fletcher's control revealed itself slowly, like a storm creeping over the horizon. At first, it sounded like harmless advice, little comments about my clothes, my friends, how I spoke in public. Over time, suggestions turned into instructions. Instructions became demands. Demands became threats. He eased me away from my college friends, convinced me that my family didn't fit the image he needed for his social circle, and gradually made sure I depended on him for everything. My access to money was reduced to a monthly allowance. What I'd mistaken for protection was really ownership. For 25 years I lived as Fletcher's wife, reciting the lines he'd written for me. I learned when to stay quiet at dinner parties, how to dress just modestly and tastefully enough for his networking events, how to ask permission before spending money or making plans. I became the sort of woman who apologized for existing too loudly in rooms where I already felt like an intrusion. But I never forgot Julian. I carried our story inside me like a hidden wound that never fully healed. I kept his grandmother's emerald ring tucked away in my jewelry box, always telling myself I would return it someday when it didn't hurt so much. I followed the business news obsessively, watching his name appear in articles as he built his own empire without his parents' backing. From a distance, I silently celebrated his victories and mourned his setbacks, always wondering if I ever crossed his mind. Now, sitting in Fletcher's car while he raged about how I had humiliated him, I clutched Julian's business card and felt something I hadn't felt in decades: hope. Whatever twist of fate had brought him back into my orbit, whatever cosmic joke had made him the new CEO of Fletcher's most important client, it felt like a second chance I had never dared to imagine. Later that night I sat alone in our bedroom, staring at the small white rectangle in my hand as if it might burst into flame. Julian Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwood Industries, a phone number, an email address. 30 years of silence and regret condensed into a few clean lines of text. Fletcher had locked himself in his study the moment we got home. Through the thick walls, I could still hear his voice rising and falling as he tried to spin what had happened to his business partners. Tonight had been everything to him, a chance to impress the new CEO, to save his crumbling company. Instead, he'd watched his wife's past detonate right in the middle of his carefully curated future. I should have told him years ago. I should have mentioned casually, over coffee or during one of our strained dinners, that I once knew someone named Julian Blackwood. But how do you explain that you married one man while still in love with another? How do you admit that 25 years of marriage were built on the ruins of a broken heart? I went to the back of my closet and pulled out the small wooden jewelry box buried under winter sweaters Fletcher never bothered to touch. My fingers found it easily, like they always did. The cool, familiar weight of the emerald ring Julian had given me when we were 22 and believed in forever. I had never returned it, despite years of insisting to myself that I would find a way to send it back to him. The truth was simpler and far more painful. It was the only piece of our love I had been allowed to keep. The stone caught the lamplight, scattering tiny green reflections across my palm. Julian's grandmother's ring, passed down through 4 generations of Blackwood women. He had been so nervous when he proposed, his hands shaking as he slipped it onto my finger by the campus lake, where we loved to study on warm afternoons. "It's been waiting for the right woman," he'd said, his dark eyes soft and earnest. "It's been waiting for you." I had worn it for exactly 3 months before everything collapsed. The memory of that afternoon in Charles Blackwood's office still made my hands shake. Julian's father had summoned me to the downtown Denver high-rise where Blackwood Industries ruled the skyline. I had gone there thinking we'd be finalizing wedding plans. Instead, I sat across from a man whose cold eyes and practiced smile made my skin crawl. Miss Campbell, he said, leaning back in his leather chair like a predator satisfied with the position of its prey. I understand my son has made you certain promises. I lifted my chin, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. When I was 22, I honestly believed courage could fix anything. Julian and I are engaged, I told his father, forcing my voice to stay steady. We're planning to marry after graduation. Charles Blackwood laughed, a dry, joyless sound. Are you? He said. How interesting. Tell me, what do you imagine married life will be like? The country club memberships, the charity galas, summers in the Hamptons. Do you really think you'll fit into our world, Miss Campbell? I think love is more important than social status, I replied, though my voice had started to shake. Love? He repeated, as if the word itself were distasteful. Let me tell you something about love, Miss Campbell. Love is a luxury people in my family can't afford. Julian has responsibilities. To this company, to our name, to a legacy that's 4 generations deep. He will marry someone who supports those responsibilities, not someone who drags them down. I opened my mouth to argue, but he lifted a hand and I fell silent. You're on a partial academic scholarship, aren't you? He continued smoothly. Majoring in literature, minoring in education. Your father works in construction. Your mother is a secretary at an insurance company. Middle class, respectable, I'm sure, but not exactly the background we expect for a Blackwood daughter-in-law. Every word was a precision strike, and each one landed. My face burned with humiliation and anger, but he wasn't finished. I've done my homework, Miss Campbell. 1 phone call from me to the right person at Colorado State, and your scholarship disappears. Your grades are excellent, yes, but there are plenty of excellent students who need that financial aid. Without that scholarship, you'll be forced to drop out, won't you? All those dreams of becoming a teacher, of making something of yourself, gone. My mouth went dry. That scholarship was everything. Without it, college was over. My parents couldn't pay my tuition, and I was already working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. But that's not all, Charles went on, his smile widening. Julian thinks he's ready to give up his trust fund for you, to make his own way in the world. Very romantic. But what he doesn't understand is that I can make sure he fails. Every door he tries to open, I can close. Every job he applies for, every business loan he needs. I have connections everywhere, Miss Campbell. I can see to it that Julian Blackwood ends up as just another college graduate with an expensive degree and no prospects. I sat frozen, finally grasping the true reach of the Blackwood power. This wasn't about disapproval. It was annihilation. So here's what's going to happen, Charles said, leaning forward over his polished mahogany desk. You're going to break up with my son. You're going to tell him you've realized the 2 of you are incompatible, that you want different things. You'll give back his grandmother's ring and walk away. And in return, I'll ensure you keep your scholarship and graduate on schedule. I might even put in a good word for you with a few local school districts when you're ready to start teaching. The offer was both cruel and calculated. He was buying me off. But he was also dangling the only real chance I had at finishing my education and building a life of my own. And if I refuse, I asked, though I already knew. Then you'll both be destroyed, he said calmly. Julian will spend the rest of his life blaming himself for ruining your future, and you'll spend the rest of yours blaming yourself for ruining his. Either way, your relationship won't survive. This way, at least one of you gets to keep your dreams. I should have gone straight to Julian and told him everything. I should have thrown his father's threats in the trash and trusted the man I loved. But I was 22, terrified, and keeping a secret I hadn't shared with anyone. I was pregnant with Julian's child. I'd found out 3 days before my meeting with Charles, sitting on the cold tile of my dorm bathroom floor, staring at 2 pink lines on a plastic stick with shaking hands. 2 lines that changed everything. I'd planned to tell Julian that weekend. I'd pictured his face lighting up with stunned joy. We'd talked so many times about children, about the family we'd build someday. Someday had simply arrived earlier than expected. But we loved each other. We would figure it out. Except now, Charles's threats weren't just aimed at us, they were aimed at the tiny life growing inside me. If I defied him, he would crush Julian's future, erase my education, and ensure our baby was born into chaos and poverty. I made the choice that still haunts me. I decided to sacrifice our love to protect our child's future. Breaking up with Julian was the hardest thing I had ever done. I met him at our usual coffee shop near campus, the little place where we'd spent hours studying and daydreaming about the life we'd share one day. He was already there when I walked in, sitting at our table by the window. His face lit up the way it always did when he saw me. "There's my beautiful fiancé," he said, standing to kiss me. "How did the meeting with my father go? I hope he wasn't too intimidating. He can be a bit intense about business." I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. Instead, I stared at the emerald ring on my left hand, the stone catching the afternoon sunlight. "We need to talk, Julian," I said. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his smile vanished instantly. "What's wrong?" he asked. I forced myself to meet his gaze, those dark eyes that had looked at me with nothing but tenderness for the past year. "I've been thinking about our engagement," I said, my voice unsteady, "about what marriage would really mean." "Okay." He sat back down slowly, a trace of concern shadowing his features. "And? I don't think we're right for each other." The lie tasted like poison. "We want different things from life," I added. Julian stared at me, confusion and pain fighting for control of his expression. "What are you talking about, Marin? We've planned everything together. We do want the same things." "No, we don't." I slipped the ring from my finger, the band sliding easily over my knuckle. It had been loose lately. I hadn't been able to eat much since I'd found out I was pregnant. "I've realized I'm not cut out for your world," I said. "The country clubs, the expectations, the pressure to be someone I'm not. I want something simpler." "Then we'll have something simpler," Julian said immediately, reaching across the table for my hands. "Marin, I don't care about any of that. We can live however you want to live." I pulled my hands back before his touch could dismantle my resolve. "It's not just about how we live," I whispered. "It's about who we are. You're going to inherit your family's business. You need a wife who can move in that world, who understands it. That's not me." "You are that person," Julian insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "You're smart and kind and beautiful. You're everything I want in a wife, in a partner. Marin, where is this coming from? Last week you were excited about looking at apartments. What changed?" "Everything. Everything had changed when his father showed me what the Blackwoods were capable of, when I realized loving him wouldn't be enough to protect the baby inside me." Instead of saying any of that, I placed the emerald ring on the table between us. The soft click of metal on wood sounded deafening in the quiet coffee shop. "I'm giving you back your ring." Julian stared at it like it might strike him. No, Marin. This is insane. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. We love each other." "Love isn't always enough," I replied, hating how true the words felt even as I said them. "It is for us," he shot back fiercely. "It has to be." I stood up before my courage could crumble completely. "I'm sorry, Julian. I truly am. But this is for the best." "For the best?" Julian jumped to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "How is breaking up for the best? Marin, talk to me. Tell me what's really going on." For one agonizing moment, I almost did. I almost told him about his father's threats, about the pregnancy, about the impossible decision I was making. But Charles Blackwood's voice echoed in my head. "Julian will never forgive himself for ruining your future, and you'll never forgive yourself for ruining his." "Goodbye, Julian," I whispered, and walked away from the only man I had ever truly loved. 3 weeks later, I lost the baby. I was alone when it happened. Curled up in my tiny dorm room on a rainy Thursday morning, doubled over with cramps and blood soaking through my clothes. By the time I stumbled to the campus health center, it was already over. 8 weeks of pregnancy ended as abruptly and quietly as it had begun. "These things happen," the doctor said gently. "Miscarriages in the first trimester are common. It doesn't mean anything is wrong with you or that you can't have healthy pregnancies in the future. But I knew what it meant for me. I had given up Julian to protect a child who was already gone. I had destroyed our love for nothing. Julian tried to reach me in the weeks that followed, calling, leaving messages, appearing in places he knew I'd be. I dodged him with the desperation of someone whose heart couldn't take one more fracture. Eventually, he stopped trying. Eventually, he graduated and moved away. And I didn't see him again until tonight. 6 months after our breakup, Fletcher Morrison proposed. He was a business associate of my father's, 12 years older, steady and composed, nothing like Julian. He was safe. When I said yes, it wasn't out of love. It was because I was exhausted, tired of being alone with my grief, tired of taking off Julian's grandmother's ring every night and crying over what might have been. I convinced myself I could grow to love Fletcher, that safety and security were enough to build a life. I was wrong. About that, and about so many things. Now, 25 years later, I sat in the master bedroom of the house Fletcher had bought as a monument to his success, holding Julian's business card in one hand and his grandmother's ring in the other, wondering if second chances were real, or just another way the universe mocked people who had already lost everything that mattered. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to call the number on that pristine white card, whether to reopen a door I had slammed shut 30 years ago, when I was young and pregnant and convinced that love wasn't worth fighting for. The real question was whether, after all this time, I was finally brave enough to find out what might have happened if I had fought instead of run. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at Julian's card before I finally found the courage to reach for the phone. Each time I picked it up, Fletcher's voice echoed in my mind, dragging up every reason I shouldn't call, every fear that had kept me silent for 3 decades. I kept thinking about all the ways this could blow up the life Fletcher and I had so carefully constructed. But lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, I finally understood that carefully constructed was just another way of saying completely hollow. On Thursday morning, Fletcher left early for a golf meeting with potential investors, other desperate men trying to prop up failing businesses with firm handshakes and empty promises. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I walked to the kitchen phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the number stamped in silver on Julian's card. Blackwood Industries, Mr. Blackwood's office. A professional female voice answered. "This is—" I froze. I didn't know how to introduce myself anymore. I wasn't his college girlfriend. I wasn't his lost love. I was the wife of a man whose humiliation he had witnessed in front of half of Denver's elite. "This is Maren Morrison," I said at last. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to call." There was a brief pause. When she spoke again, her tone had softened noticeably. "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Blackwood has been expecting your call. 1 moment, please." The wait felt endless. I clutched the receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white, listening to a piece of classical music that instantly transported me back to the university auditorium, Julian sitting beside me, watching my face instead of the stage as I heard Mozart and Beethoven performed live for the first time in my life. "Maren." His voice came through the line like a touch, like the way he used to say my name when we were alone in his tiny apartment, wrapped around each other, whispering plans for the future. "Thank you for calling." "I almost didn't," I admitted, startling myself with my honesty. "I'm not sure this is wise." "Wise has nothing to do with it," Julian said softly. "Some things are just necessary. Can you meet me for coffee? Somewhere we can talk without interruptions." I understood exactly what he meant. Somewhere Fletcher wouldn't show up, somewhere there wouldn't be an audience. "There's a small cafe on 16th Street, I said. "The Blue Moon. Do you know it?" "I'll find it," he replied. "Can you be there in an hour?" An hour. 60 minutes to decide if I was brave enough to see him again. 60 minutes to choose between the life I knew and the possibility of something I'd believed was gone forever. "I'll be there," I said, and hung up before I could lose my nerve. The Blue Moon Cafe sat tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing store, the kind of place where students and artists stretched one cup of coffee across entire afternoons, hunched over laptops and notebooks. I'd found it years ago during one of my rare days alone, and it had become my quiet refuge. When Fletcher's control felt like a noose, I came here to remind myself that somewhere, life still pulsed with laughter and conversation that had nothing to do with quarterly losses or market trends. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a small table in the back corner where the exposed brick walls cast deep shadows and granted me a little privacy. The air was rich with the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon, and the steady hum of low conversation formed a kind of protective bubble around me. I ordered a latte I didn't really want and watched the door, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julian walked in right on time. He scanned the room, and when his eyes found mine, everything inside me clenched. In the natural light pouring through the windows, he looked different than he had at the gala. Older, obviously, but also more solid, more grounded. The boy I'd loved had become a man who didn't need to demand attention. He simply drew it, the way gravity pulls at everything around it. But when he smiled, really smiled, for the first time since that night, I could see the echo of the 22-year-old who had asked me to marry him beside a mountain lake. "You look beautiful," he said as he sat down across from me. Heat flushed my cheeks. Fletcher hadn't called me beautiful in years. Pretty, when I'd managed to meet his standards. Appropriate, presentable, never beautiful. "You look successful," I answered, deflecting his compliment because I no longer knew how to receive one. Julian's smile dimmed a little. "Success isn't the same as happiness, Marin. I learned that the hard way." The waitress appeared, and he ordered black coffee, the same way he had in college when we'd stayed up all night studying. Once she left, silence stretched between us, thick with 30 years of unspoken truths. "Why did you leave?" Julian asked at last. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "The real reason. Not the story about us wanting different things. I never believed that, not for a second." I had rehearsed this moment over and over in my mind for 3 days, carefully editing what I would say. But sitting there, staring into the eyes of the man I had never stopped loving, all those rehearsed speeches fell away. So I told him the truth. I told him about his father's threats, about that cold office high above Denver, where Charles Blackwood had calmly laid out how he would ruin both of our futures, mine, his, and the life of the child he hadn't even known existed, if I didn't walk away. I told him about everything, the pregnancy I'd hidden from everyone, the baby I lost 3 weeks after I broke his heart, the way I'd married Fletcher because I was tired of grieving alone. Julian listened without saying a word, his face growing paler with each detail. When I finally fell silent, he just sat there, fists clenched on the small cafe table. "My father threatened you," he said at last, his voice low and dangerous. "And you were pregnant with my child." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Jesus Christ, Marin." He dragged both hands through his hair, an old gesture I remembered from the days when exams or life overwhelmed him. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me with this?" "Because I was 22 and terrified," I whispered. "Because your father convinced me that loving you would ruin both our lives. Because I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Julian gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "You protected me by breaking my heart and disappearing? You protected me by letting me believe for 30 years that I wasn't enough for you to stay?" The anguish in his voice was almost unbearable. Instinctively, I reached across the table and laid my hand over his tightly clenched fist. "Julian, I'm so sorry," I said. "I truly believed I was doing the right thing." He turned his hand and laced his fingers through mine. His touch was warm and achingly familiar, even after 3 decades. "My father died 5 years ago," he said quietly. "I spent the last 15 years of his life chasing his approval, trying to prove I could succeed without him pulling the strings. I had no idea what he'd done to you, no idea what he'd said." "It doesn't matter now," I replied automatically, though we both knew it did. If anything, it mattered more than ever. It was the missing piece that explained everything. "It matters to me," Julian said firmly. "It matters because you need to understand. I never stopped loving you. Not when you walked away. Not when you married Fletcher. Not even when I married Catherine because my parents insisted I needed a suitable wife for appearances." He swallowed hard. "I searched for you, Marin, for years. I hired investigators, chased every lead. I never stopped hoping that someday I'd find you again." My chest tightened at the pain in his confession. "I divorced Catherine 3 years ago," he went on. "It was amicable. No children, no heartbreak. We both knew we'd married for the wrong reasons and stayed too long out of habit and image, and then last month my team finally found you. They tracked down your marriage records, your address. I was planning to reach out slowly, respectfully." He gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head. "I never expected to walk into that gala and see you standing there like a ghost from another life." His words settled over the table like a weight and a promise all at once. He had been looking for me, planning to contact me, holding on for 30 years, and suddenly the life I'd built with Fletcher, the routine, the facade of safety, felt paper thin. "What happens now?" I asked, afraid of the answer but needing it anyway. Julian's grip on my hand tightened. "That depends on you," he said. "I know you're married. I know this is complicated, but I also know what we had was real, and I don't believe it ever truly died. Not for me, and I don't think for you either." He was right, and we both knew it. Sitting there in that little cafe, the pull between us felt just as strong as it had when we were 22 and convinced love could defy the world. But I wasn't 22 anymore. I was 57, bound to a man who saw me as an extension of himself, not a separate human being, a man who would never willingly let me go. "Fletcher will never agree to a divorce," I said quietly. "Not unless it benefits him somehow. He doesn't see me as a person, he sees me as a prop. And with his business falling apart, he needs the illusion of a perfect marriage now, more than ever." "Then don't ask his permission," Julian said simply. "Leave him. Come work for me. I'll make sure you're protected, financially, legally." His offer hung between us, shimmering with both danger and possibility. A job would mean freedom, income of my own, a life that didn't depend on Fletcher's grudging allowance. Working for Julian would mean seeing him every day, rebuilding something we'd never truly finished. But it would also mean open war with Fletcher, who would see my working for Julian as a deliberate act of betrayal. "I need time to think," I said at last, even though part of me wanted to say yes on the spot, to walk out of that cafe and never look back. Julian nodded, understanding as he always had. "Take all the time you need," he said. Then he pulled out another business card, this one with a cell number handwritten on the back. "But Marin, don't disappear this time. Whatever you decide, don't just vanish. I can't go through that again." I took the card from him, our fingers brushing once more. "I won't disappear," I promised, and meant it. We sat in a gentle, fragile silence for a few more minutes, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold while we sifted through the wreckage of our shared past. When Julian finally rose to leave, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, just like he used to after late nights in the library when he walked me back to my dorm. "I'll be waiting," he murmured, "for as long as it takes." And I sat there in the corner of that little cafe watching him walk out of my life for the second time, wondering if this time I would have the courage to follow. I watched him walk away, this man who had loved me for 30 years without ever knowing why I'd really left him. The cafe felt suddenly hollow without him there, as if someone had dimmed all the lights. I sat alone with my cold coffee, trying to picture a version of my life where I was brave enough to choose love over safety, possibility over routine. The drive home blurred past in a mix of Denver traffic and racing thoughts. In my purse, Julian's new business card rested beside the first one he'd given me at the gala, the two of them pulsing against the leather like a secret heartbeat. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had almost convinced myself I could do it. That I could tell Fletcher I was leaving, that I was taking a job with Julian's company, that our marriage was over. But Fletcher was waiting for me in the kitchen when I walked in, and one look at his face told me my decision might not be mine alone to make. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and barely controlled anger. "I went for coffee," I replied carefully, hanging my purse on the hook by the door, trying to sound casual. "I just needed to get out of the house for a while." "Coffee," Fletcher repeated, as if the word itself offended him. "For 3 hours?" I hadn't realized how long I'd been gone. Time worked differently when you were digging through 30 years of buried emotion, trying to understand the choices that shaped your whole life. "I ran some errands afterward," I lied smoothly. "Groceries, dry cleaning, the usual." Fletcher stepped closer, his gray eyes raking over my face, looking for cracks in my story. "Groceries?" he echoed. "Then where are they?" My stomach dropped. I'd been so consumed by my conversation with Julian that I'd driven straight home without stopping anywhere. "I forgot to pick them up," I admitted. "I was distracted, thinking about other things." "What other things?" His voice dropped into that low, dangerous tone he used when he was forcing himself not to explode. "What could possibly be so important that you forgot the one thing you said you were going out to do?" I could feel the trap closing. His suspicions, always simmering just beneath the surface, were hardening into something darker. Fletcher had always been possessive, but seeing Julian at the gala had awakened something feral in him. He could feel his control slipping, and a man like Fletcher would do anything to tighten his grip on what he saw as his property. "Nothing important," I said softly, already sliding back into old patterns. "I'm sorry. I'll go back out and get the groceries now." "No." His hand shot out and clamped around my arm, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to bruise. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed. "Not today, not tomorrow, not until I figure out what the hell is going on between you and Julian Blackwood." We stood there, facing each other in the marble-floored kitchen of the house he'd bought as a monument to his success. In his eyes, I didn't see a wife or a partner. I didn't even see a person. I saw an object that had dared to grow a will of its own. And that's when it hit me with terrifying clarity. Choosing Julian wasn't just about love or second chances or making peace with the past. It was about survival. Because if I stayed with Fletcher, he would slowly destroy whatever was left of me, piece by piece, year by year, and I had already given him 25 years of my life. His grip tightened until I flinched, and I saw a flicker move across his face, something dark and disturbingly satisfied. It wasn't my imagination. Fletcher liked seeing me in pain. He took pleasure in my discomfort, in my submission, in the tiny ways he could remind me that he had power and I did not. "Let go of me," I said quietly, testing rebellion for the first time in a quarter of a century. "Or what?" His smile turned cold, predator sharp. "You'll call your boyfriend? Run to Julian Blackwood and tell him how mean your husband is being?" The mockery in his voice was deliberate, calculated to make me feel foolish and immature, to shrink my feelings down to childish fantasy. It was a tactic he had perfected over the years: belittle, dismiss, control. But something in me had shifted since that afternoon with Julian, since hearing the truth about why our love had been torn apart. Since realizing that the story I'd been telling myself for 30 years was built on someone else's manipulation. "Let go of me," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. Fletcher held my gaze for a long moment, then released my arm with enough force to make me stumble back. "You think you're in love?" he sneered. "A woman in her late 50s acting like some teenage girl with her first crush. It's pathetic, Marin." Truly pathetic. I rubbed the red marks on my arm where his fingers had dug in, marks I knew would be dark bruises by morning. "What's pathetic," I said before I could stop myself, "is a man who has to hurt his wife to feel powerful." The words were out before I could pull them back. Fletcher's face went sheet white with rage. In 25 years of marriage, I had never spoken to him like that, never challenged him so directly. We both knew, in that instant, that something fundamental had shifted. There was no going back to the careful, poisonous dance of dominance and submission that had governed our life together. "You want to talk about pathetic?" Fletcher said, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me tell you about pathetic." He stepped closer. "Julian Blackwood spent 30 years looking for you. 30 years hiring investigators, chasing dead ends, clinging to this ridiculous obsession. And do you know what's really pathetic?" His smile twisted. "I've known where you were the whole time." The words hit me like a punch. "What?" Fletcher gave a short, bitter laugh, completely devoid of warmth. "You heard me. I knew he was looking for you. I knew about the investigators, the background checks, the inquiries. I made sure every single trail went cold, every lead died. I protected you from him, Marin. I kept him away from our marriage, from our life." I stared at the man I had shared a home with for a quarter of a century and realized, with a sick twist in my stomach, that I had never truly known him at all. "You?" My voice cracked. "You knew he was searching for me?" "Of course I knew," he said. "Julian Blackwood isn't exactly subtle. Money talks, sweetheart, and his people weren't nearly as discreet as they thought." He straightened his tie, a gesture that usually signaled he was regaining his composure, but his eyes stayed cold and calculating. "The first inquiry came about 6 months after we got married. Some private investigator asking questions about you. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. My legs suddenly felt weak. I grabbed the edge of the counter to stay upright. "You never told me." "Why would I tell you?" Fletcher shot back. "So you could go running back to your college boyfriend? Blow up our marriage for some teenage love story you couldn't let go of?" He shook his head. "I protected our relationship, Marin. I protected you from making a catastrophic mistake." "You protected yourself," I said, the realization washing through me like ice water. "You knew that if Julian ever found me, if he told me the truth about why we broke up, I would leave you." Fletcher's smile turned razor sharp. "And would you have?" he asked quietly. "If he'd shown up at our door 10 years ago? 20? Would you have left me for him?" The honest answer was yes. We both knew it. Even at the lowest points of my marriage to Fletcher, when it felt like I was serving a life sentence for a crime I couldn't remember committing, I would have walked out with Julian without a moment's hesitation. Fletcher had known that. He'd depended on my ignorance to keep me bound to him. "How?" I asked, barely able to get the word out. "How did you stop the investigators?" "Money, mostly," he said casually. "Bribes, false leads, fake addresses. It's incredible what people will do for the right price." He poured himself a glass of scotch from the bottle on the counter, moving with the calm of a man discussing a business deal instead of 3 decades of calculated cruelty. "I had connections too, Marin, business associates who owed me favors, people who could make inconvenient problems disappear." I thought of Julian across from me in that cafe, telling me how he had searched for years, how he'd never stopped looking. All those wasted years, all those cases, all those detectives feeding him lies because my husband was paying them to sabotage him. "You destroyed his life too," I said, horror curling in my chest. "You didn't just keep him away from me. You tormented him, made him believe I didn't want to be found." "I saved his life," Fletcher replied coldly. "He was obsessed with you, Marin, completely consumed. If I hadn't stepped in, he would have wasted his entire future chasing after a woman who had already moved on, already chosen a different path." "I never chose you," I said, the truth burning its way out like poison. "I settled for you. I married you because I was broken and alone and convinced I didn't deserve better. But I never chose you, Fletcher. Not really." For the first time since this argument began, Fletcher actually looked wounded, not angry, not strategizing. Hurt. 25 years of marriage," he said quietly. 25 years of providing for you, protecting you, giving you everything you could possibly need, and this is what I get. Contempt. "You call it providing," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I call it buying obedience. You gave me a house and an allowance and a script to follow, but you never gave me a choice. You never gave me freedom. You didn't even give me the basic respect of the truth." "Honesty," Fletcher scoffed, letting out a bitter laugh. "You want honesty? Fine, here's some honesty for you." He took a slow sip of scotch, his eyes never leaving mine. "Julian Blackwood doesn't love you, Marin. He loves the idea of you, the memory of you at 22. He's been chasing a ghost for 30 years. There was no mistaking the intent behind his words. They were meant to cut, to make me doubt myself, to poison whatever hope Julian had rekindled. And when he realizes that the woman standing in front of him now isn't the girl he remembers," Fletcher sneered, "he'll disappear just as fast as he showed up." Once that would have worked. Once I would have believed him. But I knew, down in the deepest part of myself, that he was wrong. Julian hadn't stood in that ballroom, looked at me, 57, exhausted, worn down by years of emotional erosion, and loved some imaginary 22-year-old version of me. He had seen me as I was now, scars and all, and said he still loved me. "You're wrong," I said simply. "Am I?" Fletcher's eyes glittered. "Let me ask you something, Marin. When Julian figures out you're not the sweet little college girl he remembers, when he sees how you've let yourself go, how you've become exactly the type of middle-aged housewife he would never have chosen, do you really think he'll still want you?" I looked at this man who had spent 25 years dismantling my self-worth piece by piece and felt something in me finally snap, like a wire pulled too tight for too long. "You know what, Fletcher?" I said. "I don't care if Julian wants me or not. I don't care if he wakes up tomorrow and decides you're right about everything, because at least he gave me a choice." I reached into my purse, pulled out both of Julian's business cards, and laid them on the kitchen counter between us like a line drawn in the sand. "At least he offered me the chance to decide for myself what I want," I continued. "He didn't manipulate or control me into obedience. He offered me a job, a paycheck, independence, the chance to build a life that belongs to me, not to some man who thinks he owns me." Fletcher's face went utterly still. "You're not taking that job," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I am." "No, Marin, you're not." His voice dropped to that dangerously quiet register I knew too well. "Because if you try to leave me, if you go to work for Julian Blackwood or anyone else, I will destroy you financially. I'll make sure you get nothing in a divorce. I'll tie you up in court for years until you're too old and too broke to start over." There it was. The truth of our marriage in a single, ugly moment. Not love, not partnership, not even affection. Just ownership and control, enforced by the threat of financial ruin. Fletcher had never loved me. He had acquired me, the way he acquired expensive paintings and rare wines, something to display, to prove his taste and success. "You can try," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "But Julian has more money and better lawyers than you will ever have, and unlike you, he doesn't need to destroy people to feel powerful." The mention of Julian's resources hit Fletcher like a slap. His face flushed dark red, a vein throbbing at his temple. Fletcher hated being reminded he was nouveau riche, that his wealth was fragile, propped up by debt and bluster. Julian was everything he secretly wanted to be and never would be. Old money, real power, influence that didn't require crushing others. "Get out of my house," he said finally, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Gladly," I said, turning toward the stairs. "You'll be back," he called after me, his voice echoing off the marble. "When you realize Julian doesn't want a 57-year-old housewife, when you figure out you can't make it in the real world without someone taking care of you, you'll come crawling back. And maybe, if you beg nicely enough, I'll consider taking you back." I stopped halfway up the stairs and looked down at the man I'd been married to for 25 years. The man who had isolated me from friends and family, who had kept me ignorant of Julian's efforts to find me, who genuinely believed I was too weak to breathe without his permission. "No, Fletcher," I said quietly, "I won't be back." Because now I finally understood something essential. Whatever happened with Julian, whatever happened with the job or the future, I would rather spend the rest of my life alone than live one more day as someone's possession. As I climbed the stairs to pack, I could hear Fletcher already on the phone, his voice booming through the house in frantic explanations, probably calling his lawyer, his accountant, some business associate who would help him spin this into another story where he was the victim. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't listening with dread or guilt or an anxious need to soothe him. I heard his voice like background noise, irrelevant, temporary, something that would soon be gone from my life. I had a call to make, a job to accept, a life to take back, and it was starting now. I dialed Julian from my car in the parking lot of a downtown hotel, my hands still shaking from the confrontation. The sun was setting over the Denver skyline, turning the mountains into gold and violet shadows, the same colors I remembered from those evenings on campus when we'd studied by the lake and believed the future belonged to us. "Marin," Julian answered on the first ring, as if he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "Are you all right? You sound upset." "I'm leaving him," I said, without preamble. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Fletcher, I'm leaving him tonight, and I want to accept your job offer." There was a beat of silence on the line. Julian's voice came through the line, steady and warm. "Where are you?" "The Marriott downtown," I said. "I couldn't think of anywhere else to go." "Stay there. I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, I watched through the lobby windows as his black BMW pulled up to the valet. He stepped out in jeans and a simple gray sweater, looking less like a powerful CEO and more like the boy I'd fallen in love with in college. When he spotted me in one of the leather chairs, his whole expression softened with relief and something that looked a lot like hope. "Are you hurt?" he asked, sitting beside me. His eyes went straight to the bruises on my arm where Fletcher had grabbed me, and his jaw tightened. "Did he do this?" "It's nothing I can't handle," I replied, even though we both knew that wasn't true. Fletcher's abuse had been emotional for so long that the physical part felt less like a shock and more like an inevitable escalation. Julian reached out carefully, his fingers barely brushing the purple marks. "No one should ever lay a hand on you in anger," he said quietly. "No one, Marin." The raw concern in his voice, the tenderness in the way he studied my bruises as if he could will them away, brought tears to my eyes. I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone truly worry about my pain instead of dismissing it as overreacting. "Tell me what happened," Julian said. So I did. I told him about Fletcher's confession, that he'd known about Julian's search for decades, that he'd sabotaged every investigation, bribed and lied and blocked every path that might have led Julian back to me. As I spoke, Julian's expression shifted from disbelief to fury, his hands curled into fists on his knees. 30 years, he said at last, his voice rough. 30 years wondering if you ever thought of me, if you regretted leaving. 30 years blaming myself for not fighting harder, for not being enough to make you stay. "I never stopped loving you," I blurted, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. "Not one day in 30 years. I married Fletcher because I was shattered and alone, but I never stopped carrying you with me." Julian turned toward me fully, his eyes searching mine. "And now?" he asked quietly. "After everything, after all this time, what do you want now, Marin?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. What did I actually want from this impossible second chance? "I want to find out who I am when I'm not afraid," I said, choosing honesty over caution. "I want to see what my life looks like when I'm the one making the choices, not just obeying them. And I want to know if what we had was real enough to survive everything that happened to us." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first real one I'd seen since the gala. "Then let's find out," he said. "Together." The next morning, I walked into Blackwood Industries as Julian's new director of community relations, a role he'd created specifically for me. It drew on my background in literature and education, and my job was to build partnerships with local schools and literacy programs. It was real, meaningful work, the kind of work I'd once dreamed of doing, and the salary he offered dwarfed Fletcher's monthly allowance. $2,500 a week, Julian had said over dinner, plus full benefits, paid vacation, and complete control over your department. I want you to be financially independent, Marin. I never want you to be at the mercy of anyone else's generosity again. The money alone was life-changing, enough to rent my own place, buy my own car, choose how I spent my time and what I did with my life. But more than that, the job was proof that I could be valued for my mind and experience, not just my obedience. Julian's assistant, Rebecca, greeted me with warmth and professionalism. She took me on a tour of the building, introduced me to department heads, and walked me through the company's various community initiatives. No one treated me like the boss's charity case. They treated me like a colleague. By the end of that first day, I felt more alive and purposeful than I had in decades. But Fletcher wasn't finished trying to control me. 3 days into the job, Julian called me into his office, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind me. "Fletcher's been busy." He handed me a thick legal document, stamped with seals and loaded with threatening language. Fletcher was suing us for alienation of affection, accusing Julian of intentionally destroying our marriage and demanding financial damages. It was an outdated, almost laughable legal tactic, but Fletcher had found lawyers willing to drag it into court. He's also filed for an injunction to freeze all joint assets until the divorce is finalized, Julian added. Bank accounts, credit cards, even the car you've been driving. He's trying to cut off every resource you have. I sank into the chair opposite Julian's desk, feeling that old familiar sensation of Fletcher's control settling over me like a heavy blanket. Even after I'd walked out his door, he was still reaching for my throat, still trying to remind me that, in his mind, I only existed because he allowed it. "He wants me to crawl back," I said quietly. "He thinks if he makes me scared and desperate enough, I'll give up and return." Julian moved to sit on the edge of his desk, close enough that I could see the resolve burning in his eyes. "Then he doesn't know you at all," he said. "But Marin, there's something else, something that might change everything." He picked up another stack of papers, this set stamped with the logo of a prestigious downtown law firm. "I had my attorneys look into Fletcher's business dealings, especially his real estate investments from the past 10 years, Julian explained. "It turns out your husband has been playing some very dangerous games with other people's money." I stared at the documents, trying to untangle the legal jargon and financial terms. "What kind of games?" I asked. "The kind that can put a man in federal prison," Julian said grimly. "He's been using his development company as a front for money laundering. Dirty money goes into his projects. It comes out clean on the other side. The FBI has been building a case against him for months." The words knocked the air out of me. For all his arrogance and posturing, I had always assumed Fletcher was at least a legitimate businessman, even if not a particularly successful one. To hear he was entangled in criminal activity felt like discovering the stranger I'd married had been hiding behind my husband's face for 25 years. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I started to suspect something was off when I first researched his company for potential work," Julian admitted. "The numbers didn't add up. The funding sources were strange. But I didn't have proof until my lawyers dug deeper." I looked back down at the papers, understanding slowly settling in. If Fletcher was arrested for money laundering, his assets would be seized, his company dismantled, and whatever legal leverage he thought he had against me would evaporate. But it also meant that the man I'd lived beside for half my life was a criminal who had used our home and our marriage as camouflage. "What do we do?" I asked. Julian's expression stayed composed, but I could see the fierce protectiveness in his gaze, the same relentless loyalty that had driven him to search for me all those years. "We don't do anything," he said. "The FBI will handle it. Fletcher will face the consequences of his choices. But Marin, you need to be ready. When this breaks, and it will, there's going to be a lot of media coverage. Your marriage, your connection to me, it will all be dragged into the spotlight. It's going to be uncomfortable." I thought about the marble floors, the expensive furniture, the charity galas, all of it paid for with money that hadn't belonged to him. I thought about the way we'd entertained clients, played at respectability, lived in a house that might as well have been built on quicksand. How much of my life with Fletcher had been a lie I didn't know I was living? "I don't care about the media," I said at last. "I care about doing what's right. And the right thing is letting the truth come out, no matter what it means for him or for me." Julian nodded, something like pride softening his features. "The woman I fell in love with 30 years ago," he said, "would have said exactly that." 2 weeks later, Fletcher was arrested at his office on charges of money laundering, fraud, and tax evasion. The local news ran the story on repeat: the dramatic downfall of a prominent Denver developer, the millions in illegal funds funneled through his projects, the carefully constructed empire built on crime. Our divorce became a side note in the coverage, barely mentioned as his attorneys scrambled to keep him out of federal prison instead of wasting time on harassment suits and petty injunctions. I watched the footage from Julian's penthouse, where I'd been staying since leaving the hotel. It felt unreal, seeing Fletcher in handcuffs, being led out of the glass building where he'd strutted like a king for years. On the screen, he looked small and terrified, no longer the looming presence who had dictated every aspect of my life. "How do you feel?" Julian asked quietly, sitting next to me as the anchor moved on to another story. "Free," I said, and the word surprised me with how true it felt. "For the first time in decades, I feel completely free." Julian reached over and laced his fingers with mine. "Free to do what?" he asked. I turned to look at the man beside me, the man who had loved me for 30 years, who had given me a job, independence, and the space to figure out who I was when fear wasn't making all my decisions. I thought of the emerald ring tucked safely in my purse, the one he'd placed on my finger by a campus lake when we were young and naive and utterly certain that love could conquer anything. Maybe it could. "Free to find out if it's possible to fall in love with the same person twice," I said softly. Julian's smile was answer enough. 8 months later, I stood in front of a mirror in the bridal suite at the Four Seasons, smoothing the fabric of the simple ivory dress I'd chosen for my second wedding. It was nothing like the elaborate gown I'd worn for Fletcher. No heavy train, no dramatic veil, no frantic attempt to dress a hollow promise up as a fairy tale. This time, I wasn't trying to convince myself of anything. This time, I already knew it was a love story. The dress was simple and elegant, the kind of beauty that didn't need embellishment. It felt right for a woman who had finally learned the difference between settling and truly choosing. "You look stunning, sweetheart," Margaret said. Julian's assistant had become my closest friend over the past months, and now she was fastening a delicate strand of pearls around my neck, her own, on loan for the day. "Something borrowed," she joked softly, completing a tradition I'd barely acknowledged the first time I got married. The pearls caught the afternoon sun pouring through the windows, and for a moment I was transported back to those lazy Sunday mornings in Julian's tiny college apartment, when we'd sit side by side with the newspaper, dreaming aloud about our future. Back then we were so young, so certain that love alone guaranteed a happy ending. At 58, I knew better. Love was the beginning, not the whole story. The real marriage was built on trust, respect, shared decisions, and the 1,000 small, everyday choices that made a life feel worth living. "Nervous?" Margaret asked, stepping back to inspect me with a satisfied smile. "Excited," I corrected her, and realized it was the truth. When I'd married Fletcher 30 years earlier, I'd been numb with grief and clinging to the illusion of safety. Today, I was marrying Julian because I wanted to, because I chose him, again, because I wanted to spend whatever time I had left with the man who had loved me quietly, steadily, for 3 decades apart. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I called, expecting the wedding planner or maybe Julian's sister Catherine, who had flown in from Boston. Instead, Julian stepped into the room, impossibly handsome in a charcoal suit. Margaret made a scandalized noise. "Julian Blackwood, you know you're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony. Bad luck." He didn't take his eyes off me. "After 30 years of bad luck, I think Marin and I are due a little good fortune," he said, smiling. "Besides, I have something that belongs to her." He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the same one I remembered from our engagement all those years ago. When he opened it, his grandmother's emerald ring flashed in the light, just as it had beside that campus lake when we were 22 and foolishly certain our promises were unbreakable. "I believe this is yours," Julian said softly, taking my left hand. "It's been waiting for you to come home." I had given that ring back to him in a coffee shop 30 years earlier, convinced I was saving both our futures by breaking his heart. Now, as he slid it back onto my finger, I finally understood. Some promises are stronger than the forces that try to tear them apart. Some love is patient enough to wait 3 decades for another chance. "It still fits," I whispered, watching the emerald sparkle. "Some things are meant to be," Julian replied, lifting my hand and pressing a gentle kiss to the ring. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, muttering something about hormones and romance, but she was smiling as she herded Julian toward the door. "Out," she ordered. "The bride needs 5 more minutes, and you need to get to the altar before your guests think you've gotten cold feet." Julian paused in the doorway, looking at me with the same expression he'd worn the night of the gala. Wonder and gratitude mingled together, like he was still half afraid I might vanish. "I'll be waiting at the end of the aisle," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "You've been waiting for 30 years. When he left, I turned back to the mirror one last time. The woman reflected there was older than the 22-year-old who'd once walked down an aisle toward Fletcher, but she was also stronger, clearer, and more genuinely happy than I'd ever seen her. This was not a woman running from pain or clinging to security. This was a woman who had clawed her way back to herself and to love, and was finally brave enough to claim both. The ceremony took place in the hotel garden, with the mountains, those same familiar peaks from our college days, standing sentinel in the distance. 50 guests sat in white chairs between rose bushes and flowering trees. Friends, colleagues, people who had welcomed me into Julian's life with warmth instead of suspicion. It was everything my wedding to Fletcher had never been: small, joyful, intimate, more about love than appearances. As I walked down the path strewn with petals, I saw Julian waiting for me at the altar, his face lit with a happiness so bright it made my chest ache. Beside him stood his best man, David, his college roommate, the one who had helped him look for me in those painful years right after our breakup. I'd met David the previous month and learned that Julian had talked about me constantly in college, that even after I left, he'd held on to hope far longer than anyone thought reasonable. "He never stopped believing you were meant for each other," David had told me over dinner. "Even when he married Catherine, even during the divorce, he always said if he ever found you again, he'd spend the rest of his life making up for lost time." Now, as I reached the altar and Julian took my hands, I saw that vow written clearly in his eyes. We'd lost 30 years to other people's manipulation and our own fear. But standing there in front of our friends, beneath the open sky, I realized something else. We still had the rest of our lives, to build new memories, to create the partnership we dreamed about long ago when we were young, broke, and full of hope. The ceremony itself was short, but it felt like it contained a whole lifetime. Instead of repeating generic vows, Julian and I read our own. Words that didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but honored the pain we'd lived through and the miracle of finding each other again. When Julian spoke about loving me through 30 years of silence, about refusing to let go of the hope that someday our paths would cross again, there wasn't a single dry eye among our guests. "I promise I'll never let fear make our choices for us again," I said when it was my turn. "I promise to remember that love is something you fight for, something you choose every single day, even when it feels impossible." When the minister finally pronounced us husband and wife, Julian kissed me with 30 years of pent-up longing and gratitude. The garden around us burst into applause and laughter, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, and Julian whispering "finally" against my lips. The reception was in the hotel ballroom, the same room where Fletcher and I had endured countless business galas over the years, pretending to be a happy couple while standing miles apart emotionally. Tonight, that space was unrecognizable. Soft candlelight, low jazz music, tables full of people genuinely happy to be there. It felt like the room itself had been given a second chance, too. For our first dance, the band played the same song we'd danced to at our senior prom 31 years earlier, "The Way You Look Tonight." Back then, it had just been a pretty song. Now, its lyrics about enduring love and timeless beauty felt like they had been written for us. "Any regrets?" Julian asked quietly as we moved together, his arms steady around me. "Only one," I said, smiling up at him. "I regret that we lost 30 years, but I don't regret the road that led us back here. Without everything we've gone through, I don't think I'd understand how precious this really is." He spun me gently, and I caught sight of our guests watching us with the kind of deep satisfaction people feel when they witness a long-delayed happy ending. Margaret was on the dance floor with David, still dabbing at happy tears. Catherine was laughing and talking with my new co-workers from Blackwood Industries, people who treated me not as the CEO's wife, but as part of the family. Later, when the formal dances were over, Julian and I slipped out onto the terrace for a few quiet minutes together. The Denver skyline glittered below us, and beyond it, the dark outline of the mountains stood against the starry sky, the same mountains that had watched over us when we were students dreaming about a future we never got to live. "Remember what we used to say about those mountains?" Julian asked. I smiled. That they were here long before us, and they'd still be here long after us. That some things stay, even when everything else feels temporary. "Like us," he said softly. "Like this." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd taken earlier that afternoon. Me walking down the aisle toward him, my face lit with joy. In the background, the mountains rose behind us, silent witnesses to our second chance. "I want to remember this exactly as it is," Julian said. "The moment I finally have everything I've ever wanted." As we stood together on that terrace, surrounded by the sounds of our reception drifting out behind us, I thought about Fletcher now sitting in a federal prison, about the house that was no longer mine, waiting to be sold off by the government. I didn't feel triumph, just gratitude that his lies and control were no longer part of my life. I thought about Charles Blackwood, too. The man whose threats had torn us apart, who died believing he had succeeded in keeping his son away from the wrong sort of woman. He never lived to see us reunited, never had to face the fact that his schemes failed in the end. Maybe that was justice enough. Most of all, I thought about the woman I had been 8 months earlier, trapped, afraid, convinced that safety mattered more than happiness. She felt distant now, like a character in someone else's story. I could remember her with compassion, but I no longer saw her when I looked in the mirror. The woman standing on that terrace beside Julian was different, stronger, braver, willing to fight for what mattered. She was someone I was finally proud to be. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, gently, catching the look on my face. "The future," I said honestly. "Our future. All the mornings we'll wake up next to each other, all the decisions we'll make together instead of living like strangers under the same roof, all the years we still have left to love each other the way we always should have." Julian lifted my left hand and kissed the emerald ring that had finally found its way home. 58 isn't too late for a new beginning, is it?" he asked with a small smile. I looked at my husband, my real husband, the one I had chosen with a whole heart rather than accepted out of fear, and felt the last remnants of doubt fall away. 58 is perfect," I said. "We're finally old enough to understand what love really means, and still young enough to enjoy it for a long, long time." When we went back inside to rejoin the party, to laugh and dance with the people who had become our chosen family, I realized something important. Not every story ends with the first "I do." Sometimes, that's just the beginning. Sometimes the real story starts with a second chance, with hard-earned wisdom, with the decision to choose real love over fear, again and again, until you finally get it right. Julian and I had finally gotten it right, and we had the rest of our lives to celebrate that miracle. Now I'm curious about you, the one who stayed with me to the end of this story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever lived through something similar, stayed in a relationship out of fear, or walked away to choose yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read them all, and I'd love to know your thoughts. And before you go, I'm leaving 2 more stories on the screen, both favorites on this channel, and I promise they'll surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.